Okay, so we're going to talk about characteristics of life today. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an explanation for living, non living, and dead things, kind of the differences between those. Some of them are going to seem super obvious to you, and some maybe not so much. But the idea is that you can complete the activity that you have to do with this, and that you'll have a good understanding and grasp of the difference between the three. So, what is life? The world is made up of living and non living things. The main difference between living and non living is that a living organism is or was once alive, whereas non living things have never been alive. And that sounds like pretty common sense, pretty basic, right? But there can get a little bit of confusion when we talk about the difference between non living and dead. So, non living is not the same as being dead because non living things were never alive and therefore cannot die. So, dead things once had to have life and they died to be considered dead, whereas non living things, just like it says, they were never living. So, there are a few characteristics about living things that make them living things. So they're made up of one or more cells, and these can either be unicellular or multicellular. So when you're dealing with like a bacteria, that's a unicellular organism, whereas humans, animals, plants, those are all multicellular, but they're both considered to be living things. Another characteristic is it displays organization, and that means that it's arranged in an orderly way. So when you're dealing with like a unicellular organism, that single cell is made up of organized structures. Whereas multicellular things like, and we'll talk about this later in the semester or the year, but when you have a group of cells that are together, that makes up tissues. And then tissues together make up organs. And then it's organs within our body that perform these processes that are crucial for our survival, right? Like you have the heart, you have the kidneys, you have the liver, you have all these different organs that are crucial for our survival. Now, as far as grows and develops, that's pretty much exactly how it says. Growth is the addition of mass to an organism. So typically, it gets bigger. Development is the process of natural changes that take place during the life of an organism. So typically, as you grow, and as you grow, you develop, or as you develop, you grow, vice versa. But there are some things that maybe develop that don't get any larger, so you don't grow. However, growing and developing are both crucial characteristics of living things. Reproduction, exactly how it sounds, it produces offspring. You have, some things are more clear than others. A human gives birth to a baby, a chicken lays an egg, but then you look at things like a plant and they spread their pollen and pollination occurs. So their reproduction process looks a little differently, but nonetheless, it's reproducing. Living things also respond to stimuli. So, what that means is we have both internal or external environments, right? External environments are things that are going on around in the world around us, and internal environment is things that are taking place inside of our body. So, an example of responding to an internal stimuli, like you look at hibernation, for example, that bears do, they slow down to conserve that energy. And that is in response to that internal environment. Whereas an external environment, for example, like if you're out in the ocean and a shark smells blood, it's going to smell that and it's going to respond to that external stimuli, and it's going to start swimming towards that blood and attack. Living things also require energy. So food is their source of energy. They have to have energy to fuel their functions. Once again, the way that they acquire that energy may be different. For example, like if I need some energy, I'm going to swing through Chick-fil-A and get a number one, or, Taco Bell, whatever your favorite food is, you can go and you can get your food that way. Whereas something like a plant, they go through photosynthesis, which once again, we're going to talk about all of that later on this school year. But it's important to remember that when you're dealing with living things, these processes may look different than what we think is normal, but that doesn't make them any less living. Living things also maintain homeostasis. This is another thing that we're going to talk about later on in the school year. Homeostasis is pretty much just that point of staying even. It's when everything is running the way that it should, things are going smoothly. And the thing with homeostasis, we can get out of homeostasis. We just need some time to adjust and get back to the normal place. Like, for example, if someone is going to, let's take the Olympics, for example. If it is located in an environment or in like a culture and weather-wise that is different, maybe a different altitude than what the athlete is used to training in, then they'll maybe train in an altitude similar, and then they'll also go over to that spot before the events begin just so they can get acclimated to the altitude or whatever it is that's different about what they're used to. And that's a way of maintaining homeostasis, right? They have what seems normal to them maybe in the States, but then they go overseas and the events are taking place in somewhere that has a higher altitude. They have to go a few days early so their body can readjust and find that homeostasis again so then they can compete at the highest level. Homeostasis is one of those things where if it is not reached in the way that it should be, and it cannot be restored, death may occur. So homeostasis is also crucial for life to continue, as well as it is one of those crucial characteristics of living things. And finally, that last characteristic is adaptations that evolve over time. And an adaptation is any inherited characteristic that results from changes to a species over time. So, for example, there are good and there are bad examples of this. One example is the drip leaves in the rainforest. They, over time, just kind of adapted to be more, to be what they needed to be so that the rainforest could thrive in the way that it should. Versus maybe a not so great example, there have been recent studies and recent cases where elephants are being born with one trunk or no trunks at all. And that's because of poaching. So, these elephants are being poached for their ivory tusks. And if they are poached and then they later go on to have a child, over time they just adapt. So adaptations can be both good and bad. Typically, they're good. They change. They respond once again to that stimuli that they're around, and they think, oh, well, this could be better. And so they'll evolve and they'll adapt to get better. So what about non-living things? Non-living things are things that are not alive or do not have life in them. They may have some of those characteristics that we just talked about, but they don't have all. So let's take fire, for example. A fire can grow. It responds to stimuli. If there's more oxygen in the air, then it combusts more. It responds to gasoline. If gasoline is poured on it, it gets hotter and bigger. It responds to wind. There are these different. It moves. It can grow and reproduce in a sense that it spreads. So some people may try to argue that fire is a living thing because it has some of those characteristics. But just because it has some does not mean that it has all. And in order to be a living thing, you have all of those characteristics that we just talked about. And finally, you have dead things. Once again, these are things that which once formed a part of some living plant or animal, but now show no trace of life. So there are some things that are obvious, like a chicken tender, right? That once was a live chicken. Eggs, things like that. Those once came from a chicken. But then there are other examples like dried wood. Dry wood is from a tree or a plant. A piece of dry bone that came from an animal or a human. Leather that came from the skin of a cow. So, or a skin of an animal. So there's all these different things that you kind of have to think of. The living, that's pretty, I feel like you won't have any problems figuring out what living things are. It may throw you off if something is unicellular versus multicellular. But I think between non living and dead things, there may be some confusion. You just have to remember that dead things, although that physical thing, yeah, a bone was not a living thing, but it was a part of a living thing at one time, and therefore it is considered to be dead.